New in the last 5 minutes, protests spill over into all major Armenian cities. In the last 10 minutes, Armenia's Prime Minister Sargsyan resigns amid protests. Press Service Armenia's law enforcement officials detain 33 demonstrators and Yerevan Opposition leader released as soldiers join Armenia anti-government rallies. In the last half-hour, anti-government protesters rally and Armenia Soldiers join Armenian protests against PM. In the last hour, Kremlin calls ongoing events in Armenia domestic affair. Armenian protest leader freed. Police in Armenia release opposition protest leader Pashinyan. Live feed. Correction, Armenia protest story. In the last 2 hours, unarmed soldiers join anti-government protests in Armenia. Armenian soldiers join anti-government rally. Dozens of people in military uniforms join protesters in Yerevan. Armenia dollar bond slip mid protests. Opposition protests disrupt Georgian Armenian checkpoints. In the last 4 hours, police 33 detained as of 12 o'clock. Group of soldiers joins anti-government protests in Armenia. International community reacts to escalating situation in Armenia. Tens of thousands defy warning not to reassemble in Yerevan. Dialogue with opposition still possible, says Armenian government. Almost 300 people. Armenian opposition leader detained. Yerevan protest march reaches Bagramian Avenue. Video. Armenia's parliament speaker meets with arrested opposition lawmakers. Live stream. Fresh protests in Armenia. Armenia dollar bond slip after police detain opposition leaders. Live updates. Protesters resume rallies in Yerevan. Armenians in Turkey join protests against Sargsyan. Protest march underway at Liberty Square in downtown Yerevan. Video. In the last 6 hours, protests against Sargsyan's appointment as prime minister resume in Armenia. Protesters march in Armenia after opposition leader detained. Protests in Yerevan resume. Solidarity to Armenian people. Protest rally held in Tbilisi. Students of Armenian universities marching peacefully in Yerevan. Armenian opposition resumes anti-government protest in Yerevan. Protesters close off downtown Yerevan intersection. Yerevan bracing for fresh protests after detention of leader Sokal. Armenians protest election results in their homeland. In the last 8 hours, Armenia opposition movement leader MP taken to 7-town police precinct. 11 days of Yerevan protests. As it happened earlier today, police clash with demonstrators in Armenia. Street protests rock Armenia yesterday. Armenian PM rejects protest call to quit. Crisis in Armenia deepens. Police detaining activists from France Square. Anti-government protesters fill Yerevan's Republic Square. Huge crowds keep up pressure on Armenian PM as it happened. Second week of protests in Armenia. 10th day of Armenian Velvet Revolution. All that happened by 2100. U.S. Embassy calls on Armenian government to show restraint. Political crisis in Armenia. Armenian ABS opposition leaders amid protests. Armenian opposition leader arrested, but protesters rally. Police in Armenia detain opposition leaders. Protesters detained in Armenia as anti-PM rallies continue. EU calls on Armenia to release detained protesters. First Deputy PM Karen Karapetyan weighs in on Sargsyan. Pashinyan face-off. Opposition leader arrested as protests continue for 10 days. Armenian protesters detained at Yerevan Central Square. Video. Police detain protest leaders in Armenia. U.S. Embassy urges protesters and police to adhere to peaceful means. U.S. Embassy, we urge government to show restraint. Armenia, opposition leader being held. EU demands release of detained oppositionists in Armenia. Lithuania closely following situation in Armenia. Armenian police detain almost 200 in protests. Mass rally in Yerevan. 228 people detained, 7 taken to hospitals. EU urges renewed dialogue in Armenia.